This is the story of a man who spent 20 years carrying a hammer he could never use, not because he lost the strength to swing it, but because he refused to let go of the rage it represented. By the time he learned the truth, he'd wasted half his life on unforgiveness that poisoned only himself. His name was Henrik, and he was about to discover that the weight of holding on to pain is heavier than any iron he ever forged. This is a story about forgiveness, but more than that, it's a story about the hidden cost of refusing to forgive and who we really punish when we can't let go. Henrik walked through the village at 58 years old, carrying an old hammer in his left hand. He carried it everywhere. To the market, to the well, on his daily walk through the square where craftsmen worked and children played. People saw him coming and looked away. They whispered as he passed, their voices carrying fragments of the story everyone knew. The accident, the ruined hand, the apprentice who fled in shame, the master who never forgave. Henrik heard their whispers and felt vindicated by them. Let them remember, let them know what was taken from him. The hammer was his reminder, his memorial to injustice, his proof that he had every right to his bitterness. What he didn't realize was that the hammer had become his prison, and he was both the prisoner and the warden. 20 years earlier, Henrik was a different man. At 38, he was the finest blacksmith in 3 regions, a master craftsman whose forge was the beating heart of the village. Farmers brought him broken tools and received back implements that lasted generations. Merchants commissioned gates and fixtures that became landmarks. Artists sought his consultation on metalwork that needed both strength and beauty. His right hand was legendary. People said he could feel what the metal wanted to become, could sense the precise moment to strike, the exact angle to shape, the perfect temperature to work. He wasn't just skilled, he was connected to his craft in a way that transcended technique. He had an apprentice named Jakob, 19 years old, talented but still learning, eager to prove himself worthy of Henrik's teaching. For 3 years, Jakob had studied under Henrik, learning the basics, mastering the fundamentals, slowly earning the privilege of working on more complex projects. And then came the cathedral gates, the commission of Henrik's lifetime. The new cathedral was being built, and they wanted gates that would stand for centuries. Henrik spent 5 years designing them, planning every detail, envisioning how light would play across the metalwork, how the panels would tell stories in iron and steel. 1 year into the actual forging, the gates were nearly complete. Just finishing details remained. Jakob begged to help with the final work. "Please, master, let me learn. I'm ready. I won't disappoint you." Henrik, seeing the eagerness in his apprentice's eyes, reluctantly agreed. "Fine, but follow my instructions exactly. No improvising, no shortcuts. This is the work I'll be remembered for." The accident happened on a morning Henrik would replay in his mind 10,000 times over the next 20 years. He'd stepped away to handle an urgent repair for a villager, leaving Jakob alone at the forge with explicit instructions. Maintain the temperature, prepare the next section, wait for Henrik to return before attempting the final weld. But Jakob was young, impatient, eager to impress. He thought he could speed up the process, show initiative, prove he understood the work well enough to make decisions. He miscalculated the timing. He chose the wrong angle. He applied too much force at the wrong moment. The metal, stressed beyond its tolerance, shattered. The forge, superheated and unstable, erupted. Henrik rushed back to find Jakob unconscious on the floor and his own right hand crushed beneath a fallen section of the gate, bones and flesh mangled beyond any hope of saving. 5 years of design work, 1 year of forging, a masterpiece 95% complete, all destroyed in seconds. The village doctor amputated Henrik's hand at the wrist. There was no choice, no alternative, no way to save what Jakob's mistake had destroyed. Henrik woke from surgery to find his right hand gone, his life's work obliterated, his identity as a master craftsman effectively ended. Jakob recovered from his injuries within weeks and came to apologize, his face twisted with guilt and shame. Henrik, still in shock and pain, looked at the boy who had taken everything and said words that would define the next 2 decades. Get out of my sight. If I see you again, I don't know what I'll do. Jakob fled. Henrik's wife tried to comfort him, suggested that forgiveness might help him heal. Henrik's response was immediate and fierce. Forgive him? He took everything. My hand, my work, my future. You want me to forgive that? She tried to reason with him over the following months, but Henrik was unreachable, drowning in a bitterness that grew deeper every day. He kept the hammer from that day, the one he'd been holding when he got the news of the accident. He carried it constantly, a physical reminder of what was taken, a memorial to his destroyed dreams. His wife asked one night, exhausted from watching him spiral, "What are you going to do with that hammer, Henrik? Carry it forever?" He looked at her with eyes that had gone cold. "Yes, so I never forget what he took from me." She left him after 5 years of living with a ghost. Henrik barely noticed. He was too consumed with nursing his wound, polishing his grievance, feeding his rage. The years passed like a slow burial. Henrik tried to work with his left hand, but the frustration was unbearable. Every failed attempt reminded him of what he'd lost. He closed his forge, couldn't stand to see tools he could no longer master, couldn't bear the pity in customers' eyes. The village moved on. Other blacksmiths filled the gap Henrik left. Life continued without him. But Henrik remained frozen in the moment of the accident, replaying it, rehearsing his anger, perfecting his bitterness. Children began to fear the angry man with the hammer. Adults pitied him but kept their distance. Henrik had become a cautionary tale, a ghost haunting his own life. When does protection of a wound become a prison of your own making? Henrik never asked himself that question. He was too busy making sure everyone remembered who had wronged him. By the time Henrik turned 58, he'd spent 2 full decades in this prison. He lived alone in his abandoned forge. He had no friends, no purpose, no joy, just the hammer and the rage and the daily ritual of walking through the village, making sure people saw his bitterness, saw what he'd become, saw that he would never forget, never forgive, never move on. He'd spent 20 years making sure he never forgot what Jakob did to him. What he didn't realize was that remembering had cost him everything Jakob's mistake hadn't already taken. The accident took his hand. The unforgiveness took his life. Then a letter arrived that would change everything. It came from the cathedral, addressed in careful script. Henrik almost threw it away. He refused most contact with the outside world. But something made him open it. "Master Henrik, we've discovered something we believe you need to see. Please, come to the cathedral at your earliest convenience." Henrik's first thought was charity, pity, another well-meaning attempt to help the bitter cripple. But curiosity, long dormant, flickered to life. The next morning, hammer in hand as always, he walked to the cathedral. Brother Thomas, the cathedral master, greeted him with unusual solemnity and led him to a workshop behind the main building. "We found this in our storage," Thomas explained, opening a large door. It arrived over many years in pieces with very specific instructions to assemble it only after the donor's death. The door swung open. Henrik stepped inside and stopped breathing. There, in the workshop, Complete and magnificent stood his gates, the cathedral gates, his life's work, finished. Henrik stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. The gates were exactly as he'd designed them 20 years ago. No, they were better. Every detail he'd planned was there, executed with masterful precision. But more than that, there were additions, improvements, elements he hadn't designed, but that complemented his original vision perfectly. The metalwork was extraordinary. The craftsmanship was flawless. These weren't just completed gates, they were a masterpiece. Brother Thomas spoke quietly. They arrived in sections over 15 years, always anonymously, always with precise assembly instructions. We followed those instructions, and this is the result. Henrik's voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. "Who?" Thomas handed him a sealed envelope. "This came with the final section 6 months ago. Instructions said to open it only in your presence." Henrik's hands shook as he opened the letter. The handwriting was older, more refined, but he recognized it. Jakob. The letter was dated 6 months earlier, and its contents would shatter everything Henrik had built his life around for 20 years. Jakob explained that he'd left the village in shame and spent 2 decades learning advanced techniques from masters across the country. He'd worked in forges from the capital to the coast, mastering methods Henrik had never seen, developing skills that went beyond what Henrik had taught him. And he'd used every bit of that knowledge for one purpose, completing Henrik's masterwork. "I destroyed your hand and your gates," the letter read. "I couldn't give you back your hand, but I could finish your life's work. I know you hate me, I know you'll never forgive me, but I needed to honor what you taught me, even if you never knew it was me." The letter continued, explaining the years of secret work, the careful shipping of sections, the detailed instructions for assembly. And then, near the end, a devastating revelation. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Terminal illness. I have weeks, maybe days. I'm writing this from hospice care." The final lines, "I'm sorry, Master, for everything I've carried, what I did to you every day for 20 years. But at least your gates will outlive us both. At least something beautiful came from all this pain." Henrik collapsed. The hammer, carried for 20 years without ever setting it down, fell from his grip and clattered on the stone floor. The sound echoed in the workshop like a bell marking the end of something. 20 years of rage confronted 20 years of penance he'd never seen. While Henrik cultivated bitterness, Jakob cultivated redemption. While Henrik nursed his wound and polished his grievance, Jakob honored their shared craft and completed what his mistake had destroyed. While Henrik spent 20 years making sure everyone knew he'd been wronged, Jakob spent 20 years trying to make it right in the only way he could. And Henrik, blinded by his unforgiveness, never saw any of it. Brother Thomas helped Henrik to a bench. "The gates are magnificent," he said gently. "They'll stand for centuries. Both of you created something eternal." Henrik looked up through tears. Where is he now? Thomas consulted the letter. According to his final correspondence, he entered hospice care in a city 2 days' journey from here. "That was 6 months ago." Henrik's voice was urgent. "Is he still alive?" Thomas's face showed sympathy. "I don't know. The letter came with the final gate section. That was 6 months ago. I tried to write back but received no response." For the first time in 20 years, Henrik left his hammer behind. He left it lying on the workshop floor and walked out without it, feeling strangely light and terribly frightened. He returned to his home, gathered a few supplies, and began the 2-day journey to find Jakob. Every mile, he wrestled with 20 years of identity built on being the wronged master. If he forgave Jakob, who was he? What had the last 20 years meant? His entire sense of self was constructed around this grievance. If he released it, what remained? The hospice was in a city Henrik had never visited. He found it on the second evening, exhausted and anxious. He approached the front desk, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm looking for a patient, Jakob. He would have been here 6 months ago, maybe still." The nurse's face showed sympathy immediately, the kind of expression that delivers bad news before words do. "Jakob passed away 2 weeks ago. I'm very sorry." Henrik felt the words like a physical blow. Too late. After 20 years of anger, he'd finally understood, finally wanted to forgive, finally was ready to release it. And he was too late. Was anyone with him when he died? The nurse shook her head. No, he had no visitors the entire time he was here. He mostly talked about a blacksmith he once apprenticed under, though. Seemed to carry deep regret right to the end. She paused, then added, "He did leave something. Said if anyone ever came asking about him to give them this." She handed Henrik a small package wrapped in cloth. Henrik found a quiet chapel nearby and opened Jakob's final gift with trembling hands. Inside were detailed drawings of the completed gates, notes on every technique used, every decision made. A separate notebook contained something even more precious. Lessons I learned from Master Henrik to pass on to future apprentices. Every lesson Henrik had ever taught Jakob, meticulously documented. The fundamentals of the craft, the philosophy behind the technique, the wisdom Henrik had shared over 3 years of apprenticeship. Jakob had preserved it all, honored it all, built his entire career on it. The final page contained a note. "Master, I don't expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know you made me who I became. The mistake was mine, the craft was yours. Thank you for teaching me that mastery means never giving up, even when you've destroyed everything. I spent 20 years trying to prove I learned that lesson. I hope the gates show you I did." Henrik wept in that empty chapel. Not just for Jakob's death, but for 20 years wasted in bitterness, while Jakob wasted 20 years in penance. 2 lives consumed by a single moment, both men imprisoned by the same accident in different ways. But Jakob had found purpose in his prison. He'd turned guilt into dedication, shame into mastery, regret into redemption. Henrik had turned his pain into nothing but more pain. Jakob spent 2 decades creating something beautiful while carrying crushing guilt. Henrik spent 2 decades creating nothing but isolation while carrying righteous anger. And now Jakob was gone, never knowing if his penance meant anything, never receiving the forgiveness he'd spent his life trying to earn. Henrik understood finally, completely, devastatingly, his inability to forgive hadn't punished Jakob. It had punished only Henrik. Jakob found redemption through his work. Henrik found only bitterness. The person he hurt most with his unforgiveness was himself. 20 years, 7,300 days. He'd spent every single one of them carrying a hammer he couldn't swing, nursing a wound he wouldn't let heal, holding a grudge that served no purpose except to make him miserable. And for what? To prove he'd been wronged? Everyone already knew that. To make Jakob pay, Jakob had paid in ways Henrik never saw. To protect himself from more pain, he'd done nothing but inflict more pain on himself every day for 2 decades. Henrik returned to his village, transformed but shaken. He went directly to the cathedral and stood before the completed gates, really seeing them for the first time. They were extraordinary. They were his vision and Jakob's skill combined. They were what forgiveness might have created if he'd been capable of it 20 years ago: collaboration instead of catastrophe, healing instead of bitterness, art instead of anger. Brother Thomas found him there, standing with his remaining hand pressed against the metal. "Are they what you hoped for, Henrik?" Henrik's answer was quiet but certain. "They're better than I imagined, because they're not just mine anymore. They're ours, and that makes them more than I could have created alone." Henrik returned to his forge for the first time in 20 years. The space was dusty, abandoned, filled with tools he'd refused to touch. But he didn't see failure anymore. He saw possibility. He looked at the hammer lying where he'd left it 20 years ago, the hammer he'd carried as a symbol of what was taken. He picked it up and felt its weight. It was heavy. So heavy. How had he carried this for 20 years? The weight of unforgiveness is deceptive. It starts as protection, as righteous anger, as justified bitterness, but it accumulates, growing heavier with each day. You refuse to set it down until one day you realize you've been carrying a burden that serves no purpose except to crush you. Henrik made a decision. He lit his forge for the first time in 2 decades. The flames felt like home and judgment at once. Using only his left hand, awkwardly, painfully, he began to work. He melted down the hammer he'd carried for 20 years, the hammer that represented his rage, his pain, his 20-year prison sentence. He worked for weeks, failing repeatedly, having to restart again and again. His left hand was weak, unpracticed, uncertain, but he persisted, learning to work with his limitation instead of being defeated by it. And slowly, a new form emerged. Not a weapon, not a tool, a memorial plaque. The inscription Henrik forged read, "Henrik and Jakob, master and apprentice, together created beauty that will outlive bitterness." He mounted it at the base of the cathedral gates. Standing there, alone in the early morning, he spoke words he wished Jakob could hear.
"I forgive you. Not because what happened was okay. Not because the accident didn't cost me everything. But because carrying this rage cost me even more. You spent 20 years trying to earn forgiveness I refused to give. I spent 20 years poisoning myself with bitterness while you were honoring me. We both deserved freedom."
"You found yours through creating something beautiful. I'm finding mine by finally letting you go." Word spread that Henrik had reopened his forge. A young person knocked on his door asking if he took apprentices. Henrik's immediate reaction was fear. What if another mistake happened? What if he trained someone who destroyed something precious again? But then he asked himself a different question. What would Jakob want? What would honor his memory? Henrik accepted the apprentice, and he discovered something unexpected. Teaching with his left hand, with his limitations visible, with his story known, made him a better teacher than he'd ever been, with 2 good hands and a perfect reputation. Henrik taught differently now, not just technique, but wisdom earned through suffering. He told his apprentices Jakob's story honestly, holding nothing back. "My apprentice made a mistake that cost me my hand and destroyed my masterwork. I spent 20 years hating him for it. He spent 20 years completing what I couldn't. Who do you think lived a better life?" He let the question sit with them. Then, forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about refusing to let what happened poison every day after. Jakob's mistake took my hand. My unforgiveness took 20 years. The mistake was his choice. The wasted decades were mine. Months after reopening the forge, Henrik received an unexpected visitor. An older woman stood in the doorway, her face familiar despite the years. his ex-wife, drawn back by rumors of his transformation. She walked through the forge, saw him teaching a young apprentice with patience he'd never shown before, saw the light in his face that had been extinguished for so long. "You let it go," she said simply. Henrik nodded. 20 years too late. But better late than never. She looked at him with something like wonder. "I never thought I'd see you at peace. I'm proud of you, Henrik." They didn't reunite as lovers. Too much time had passed. Too much damage had been done. But they found friendship again, the kind built on honesty and hard-won wisdom. And that was enough. Henrik made visiting the cathedral gates part of his daily routine. Not to remember the accident, but to remember what became possible when bitterness was transformed into beauty. He brought his apprentices there regularly, using the gates as his primary teaching tool. "In these gates represent the best of what I was and the best of what Jakob became," he'd tell them. "Everything between 20 years of my life was waste. I chose to carry rage instead of creating something new. Don't make my mistake. If someone wrongs you, feel the pain. Acknowledge the loss, but then ask yourself, how long am I willing to let this moment define me? How many years am I willing to sacrifice to being right about who hurt me?" Henrik wrote an open letter to the village and posted it in the square where craftsmen worked and people gathered. It began, "I am the man who carried a hammer for 20 years. I carried it as proof of my pain, as memorial to injustice, as weapon of my anger. I thought I was protecting myself. I was actually imprisoning myself. Jakob, my apprentice who made the mistake that cost me my hand, spent those same 20 years completing my masterwork in secret. While I was carrying rage, he was carrying guilt. The difference is his burden created something beautiful. Mine created only more pain." The letter continued explaining Jakob's redemption, the completed gates, the forgiveness that came too late. It ended with a question. If you're carrying something, a grudge, a grievance, a wound you won't let heal, ask yourself honestly, is this weight protecting you or imprisoning you? I chose prison for 20 years. Please don't make my mistake. Henrik never got his right hand back. He never got those 20 years back. But he got his life back the moment he decided to release the weight he'd been carrying. His forge became warm and productive again. His teaching became profound because it was earned through suffering and transformation. His apprentices learned not just the craft of blacksmithing, but the craft of forgiveness, the skill of letting go, the wisdom of knowing when holding on becomes holding yourself hostage. One afternoon, teaching a young apprentice the basics of metalwork, Henrik watched the girl make a mistake. She dropped a heated piece, ruining hours of work. Her face filled with terror, expecting rage, anticipating punishment. Henrik smiled, and in that smile was 20 years of hard-won wisdom. It's okay. Mistakes are how we learn. What matters is what you do after. Learn from it. Try again, and don't carry it for 20 years like I did. The girl, confused by his kindness, asked, "You're not angry?" Henrik looked at his left hand, then at the forge around him, then out the window toward where the cathedral gates stood eternal. "I spent too many years angry. It didn't fix anything. It didn't heal anything. It just made me bitter and alone. You're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. The question is, will you learn and grow, or will you carry them like weapons?" I chose wrong. I hope you'll choose better. On the wall of Henrik's forge hung a sketch of the cathedral gates, signed by both Henrik and Jakob, their names side by side, as they should have been all along. Beneath it, Henrik had inscribed new words. "The weight of unforgiveness is heavier than any iron. Release it before it crushes you." Students who trained under Henrik in those final years spoke of him with reverence, not for his technical skill with one hand, but for his wisdom about what matters. They spread his story, and it became something of a legend in blacksmithing circles: the master who lost his hand but almost lost his soul, and the apprentice whose mistake became redemption. Henrik lived another 15 years after reopening his forge. He trained dozens of apprentices, created works that mattered, rebuilt relationships he'd destroyed, found peace he'd thought impossible. And every single day, he visited the gates and spoke to Jakob, sharing what he'd learned, thanking him for the lesson that came too late, but still came. You spent 20 years trying to earn my forgiveness, Jakob. I spent 20 years refusing to give it. You were free the moment you started creating again. I was only free when I finally let you go.
I'm sorry it took so long, but I want you to know I forgive you. And more than that, I thank you. These gates are proof that beauty can come from pain if we're willing to do the work. You did the work I finally learned to. When Henrik died at 73, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of teaching, they buried him near the cathedral gates.
His gravestone was simple. Henrik, master blacksmith. He carried a hammer for 20 years. He forged beauty for 15. One was wasted, one was lived. The gates still stand today, centuries later, exactly as Henrik envisioned and Jakob completed. They're considered a masterpiece of collaborative craftsmanship. Though few people know the story of how they came to be, the 20 years of bitterness and penance that separated their conception from their completion, the lesson they represent about the cost of unforgiveness and the freedom of letting go. What hammer are you carrying? What weight are you holding that's preventing you from creating anything new, from living fully, from being free? Who are you punishing with your unforgiveness, them or yourself? Henrik learned too late that the person who can't forgive becomes the person who can't live. The grudge you're nursing, the wound you're protecting, the anger you're feeding, it's not hurting the person who wronged you. They've likely moved on, forgotten, or like Jakob, spent years trying to make amends you refused to see. You're the one carrying the weight. You're the one whose hands are too full of bitterness to hold anything new. You're the one choosing the prison. Henrik spent 20 years being right about who wronged him. He was absolutely, completely, undeniably right. Jakob made a terrible mistake that cost Henrik everything. Henrik's anger was justified, his pain was real, his loss was devastating. But being right didn't heal him. Being right didn't create anything beautiful. Being right didn't give him peace or purpose or freedom. Being right just made him bitter and alone while years passed and life went on without him. You can be right and still be miserable. You can be justified in your anger and still be imprisoned by it. Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about you. It's not about excusing what they did or pretending it didn't hurt or acting like it's all okay now. It's about refusing to let what they did continue to control your life, poison your present, destroy your future. It's about setting down the hammer you've been carrying and discovering that your hands were meant for creating, not for carrying rage. Henrik's hands were meant for forging beauty. For 20 years he used them only to hold bitterness. What are your hands meant for? And what are you filling them with instead? You still have time. Henrik didn't, but you do. Whatever you're carrying, whatever weight you're holding, whatever grudge you've been nursing, you can set it down. Not tomorrow, not when they apologize, not when you feel ready. Now, this moment. You can choose freedom over being right. You can choose life over vengeance. You can choose to forge something beautiful instead of carrying something dead. The gates are waiting to be built, but first you have to put down the hammer, will you?